Welcome back to Modern Education. I'm the host, Benjamin S. Woodford, here in the studio with you once again for another exciting conversation and guest. And my co-host this week is not in the studio. Emily Quiles is out. She had some other business to attend to. So if you are a fan of the Quiles, you're going to have to come back next week for a little bit more Emily on the mic. But today, I am excited to bring another guest on the mic with you. The guest this week is Chris Field. Chris Field is a climate change researcher. He works in the... sorry, my notes just disappeared here. He's a climate scientist, works on a project in collaboration with the Sean N. Parker Center for Allergy and Asthma Research here at Stanford. His current work examines wildfire effects on respiratory illness and does research here, primarily, I believe, in California, on the wildfires and what is going on with that. So I'm going to bring Chris right on the mic right now, and we're going to get started with the conversation.
Hi, Ben. It's great to be here.
Great to have you here, Chris. I really appreciate you making the time to come down. This is such an important topic for us to dive into. So we'll just jump right in. I'm really curious, just for the listeners' sake and understanding where you're coming from here, how did you become a climate change researcher and scientist, and what drew you into this field?
Well, I've worked on natural ecosystems throughout my whole research career. I was a graduate student at Stanford in the 1970s and was really interested in how plants grow, how they integrate up to the global scale. And as I've gone through my career, it's been more and more important to put these biological processes in the context of the human changes that the world is experiencing. And right now, the real focal point of the intersection between biological processes and human processes is wildfire, especially in California.
Okay, so you almost started in a whole different field, looking at the biology and different associated parts there, and realized that brought you into this climate and the whole ecosystem and everything connecting to it.
Yeah, my history as a scientist is I started out being interested in how plants grow, and then I was interested in how forests grow, then I was interested in how humans change things. And mostly now, to be honest, I'm interested in solving environmental problems and finding ways that we can have a sustainable biosphere moving into the future.
Okay. So it's almost as if you started looking at just trying to understand how things work, and you ended up becoming more of an activist and trying to actually create change around these issues that you spent so much time understanding.
Well, I think about it more as a solutions provider than an activist.
Okay.
But there's a little bit of each.
Yeah. I imagine providing solutions almost requires at least somebody does the activism to implement those solutions, but not necessarily the same thing.
You know, in the university, a lot of the way we deliver solutions is by working with partners, and sometimes that's a private company, sometimes the government, sometimes it's an NGO.
Okay. So there's definitely an element here of partnerships along the way that make your work able to be disseminated into the rest of it.
This is always true with new developments from research.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, I would like to start by just sort of establishing a baseline here. And I don't want you to hold back with me at all on this. Now, in political spheres, there's still a lot of debate as to, is climate change a real thing? Does it exist? Is it something we should be worrying about? And I'm curious, as being a researcher and a scientist who is in the know, I would say, on that end of the debate, is there still a debate around if climate change is or isn't happening?
No, there's no question. The data about human-caused warming, truly not equivocal in any sense. There's absolutely no disagreement about whether we've seen quite profound warming of the planet over the last century or so. And there's essentially no debate about whether human causes, especially the release of heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, are the overwhelmingly important cause. No question whatsoever. In fact, people often don't realize, but the definitive paper on how greenhouse gases cause climate warming was really published in 1896, more than 120 years ago, and no one has found a flaw in that paper's fundamental arguments in 120 years, even though there have been many, many efforts to find a flaw. The greenhouse warming theoretical foundations and the validation from evidence is simply one of the most robust pieces of science we have.
Wow. Okay. So you're telling me, even with all of this debate going on in the news and all of the political rhetoric around this, that we have basically had a good understanding of this for well over 100, 120 years as far as what's happening. And the science is pretty much unequivocally in agreement that that's what's happening.
Absolutely. We have multiple lines of evidence. They're independent of each other. Every direction the scientific community comes at this question to ask whether climate change is occurring, whether it's human caused, and whether it'll get more serious in the future, points unequivocally to the answer yes.
Okay, well, you've heard it here, folks. There is no more debate. That part is done. We're going to move on with the rest of our conversation, assuming that that is the case and not even worry about whether or not climate change is a thing to worry about. Instead, we're just going to say, please stop having that debate and move towards solution-minded conversations. Okay, so I'm just going to move on from that altogether. I just wanted to get that out as a baseline for our listeners. And now, thinking about that, we've had wildfires pretty regularly, at least the last couple of years, and they've been pretty devastating. What in your research or in your understanding is the cause of this, or why is it becoming more prevalent now than it has been?
Well, California has had devastating wildfires over many decades, almost certainly over hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing three challenges come together in recent years that have led to a series of almost unimaginably destructive wildfires. And these three changes are first of all, the warming climate, and we know that the wildfire season is getting longer and the preconditions for fire are being intensified.
And is that just a symptom of a slightly warmer temperature?
Well, it depends where you are in the state.
Yeah.
In some places, the most important controller is how long a time is there between when the snow melts in the spring and when it snows again in the fall. Mm. And you can think about that as opening a window for wildfire, and the longer that window is, the more likely you're to get a fire. The longer that window is, the more it's going to dry out during the summer as well. And the drier the conditions are, the more ripe you are to have a fire take off.
Okay, and I think there's something in that about, it seemed like we had a lot more rain this year than we've had a drought for many, many years, and we're just starting to get more rain. Is the rain actually contributing in any way to the fire season? Is there more growth or undergrowth happening because of our increased rain, and then this larger window without it is what is kind of creating that dry spell?
So that's a really good question, and in California, we have what's called a Mediterranean type climate. It's cold and rainy in the wintertime.
That's why we can grow wine here,
hot
right?
and dry in the summertime.
Yeah.
Exactly. Then we have a lot of the same plants and animals as in the true Mediterranean, mm-hmm. and all Mediterranean type habitats tend to have a problem with wildfires.
Okay.
So it's not a big surprise. The question about whether an especially rainy year causes an especially serious wildfire season depends on where you are. Mm-hmm. In areas of grassland where the extra rain contributes to extra growth of the grasses and extra fuel, there's probably more risk of fires. In the high elevations in the mountains where extra precipitation accumulates as snow and that snow melts later, that tends to shorten this window of wildfire
because the runoff of the snowfall actually becomes like a trickle down of more moisture in the lower lands.
Well, or in the high areas, they're really just covered with snow.
Okay.
Squaw Valley says they're going to run the ski lifts through the 4th of July, and that really shortens the fire window. When we get into the foothills and the lower elevations, it's hard to say which direction this extra rainfall that we had in 2019 is going to push things.
Right. Okay, so there isn't a clear formula for this. It is very much context and I'd say land use dependent, right? Whatever's happening in that land is going to be a big factor as far as how the fires are.
A general rule is that a rainy wintertime probably leads to a worse fire season in the lower elevations and a less overall fire risk in the highest elevations.
Okay, that makes sense. And then when we're talking about people living in these different regions, are they able to have any real bearing on what's going on? Do people have a chance to help clear their land, or is there something that they can do if you know you're living in a fire area or high risk area?
Absolutely. One of the things that really exaggerates the fire risk, at least the risk of damage to property and lives in California, is that so many people now live in what we call the wildland-urban interface. A lot of times people call it the WUI. And in the United States, overall, the Forest Service estimates that 1/3 of Americans live in the WUI. And in California, as we've seen more and more people move into the foothills and more people move into the suburbs, the number of people who are in areas that are difficult to protect from wildfire really increased dramatically. And that's one of the main reasons we face this increased risk in recent years. Now, there are still lots of things you can do to protect your property and to ensure your own safety, even if you do live in the WUI. And the most two important things are to assure defensible space so that if a fire's moving through the vegetation, it doesn't move right up to your house. And, and the second thing that's important is to use modern building standards. And we know a huge amount about how to build houses so they're less likely to catch on fire. And that makes a big difference in whether or not the house burns down. And one of the huge and tragic consequences of the fires that we've had recently, especially the fire in Paradise, is that there were lots of old structures that weren't really built to modern standards. And the reason the whole town burned down was that there were relatively few houses that were fire resistant.
Right. So I'm imagining, and I know this is probably not really your field of expertise, but I'm imagining there's a lot interacting there between poverty and resources and being able to protect your home.
At many different levels. One of the real challenges we face now in California is that the affordability crisis in the big cities, like in the Bay Area, has really forced a lot of lower income people into the WUI, where they clearly don't have the extra financial resources that are required to upgrade the structure that they live in. And so we're seeing not only people moving into the WUI by choice, but by necessity because their finances are pushing them there.
Right. And I imagine people, I mean, this is purely speculative, but I imagine people who have more finances and resources, maybe if they're buying a house out in these areas, it's a summer home or it's like an extra cottage that they've paid for beside their regular home. And a lot of people with lower income are essentially being forced into these places because they can't afford living in like the Bay Area or San Francisco, for instance.
Yeah, there are definitely equity issues, but there are also kind of aesthetics issues. And a lot of times people, for example, like the mountain cabin-y look of having a shake roof. Shake roofs are really terrible in a fire.
Right.
And there are lots of the construction techniques that make a house harder to catch on fire, make it look less like a traditional mountain cabin.
Right.
And so even in more wealthy communities, we find it hard to convince people to take the steps that can make their properties fire safe.
Oh, wow. So there is almost an ego built into creating some of these problems.
Think of it more as an aesthetic.
Right.
And in most places now, the building code requires extra fire safety steps in the WUI. And so for new construction, people don't really have the option of building a dangerous structure. But for old construction built before the standards were in place, many of the structures really are fire at risk.
Right. And I imagine that all gets grandfathered in because we can't just force people to make huge construction changes because a new law came out.
And that's the way zoning works almost everywhere.
As they make changes, that's the only time we can require that.
Right.
So it leaves a lot of, I'd say even neighbors may be vulnerable because of their other neighbors not being up to code or...
Yeah, one of the things that's happened in the horrific recent fires we had in Paradise or in Santa Rosa is that the fire was moving from house to house more than moving from the natural vegetation to a house. Right.
Yeah, that the fire in both of those towns has just been devastating because of the close nature of how many houses were near each other.
Well, and I think a lot of people were surprised at how far burning embers could move and the really high winds that they had. The hot, dry winds were meaning that big burning pieces of stuff would fly through the air for hundreds of yards. And so part of the reason those two fires moved so rapidly is these big pieces of burning material would jump hundreds of yards, half a mile, even a mile ahead of the fire front and start new fires.
Right. So we have this thing where there's essentially just little burning pieces of ember flying into the air and landing down anywhere. And that gives the fire essentially legs to spread in lots of different ways, even without a direct line of connection, right?
Right. If you look at the video from, for example, the Paradise Fire, I mean, it just seems like the fire is moving horizontally and doing these big jumps at the same time. It's really a terrifying kind of situation.
Yeah, I grew up in Santa Rosa, and I went up there after the fire happened there, and it was just absolutely devastating to see a neighborhood just flattened. I mean, there was nothing left, just husks of cars that had been burnt to the ground, and it truly is a terrifying thing to see that in a neighborhood. I mean, I knew people that lived in that neighborhood before it happened, and it's just unbelievable to see. And I think even for some of the families I know that were affected, I mean, it's just devastating to see how much that can take apart your lives and your livelihood and your family and everything.
Heart-wrenching to see, and the accounts of people who had first-hand experience, absolutely terrifying. You don't know where to go. You don't know what roads are available. You don't know whether emergency services are available. Right. And the communications are down. Just a unimaginably scary situation.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm just going to go off of what you just brought up here. This emergency planning and evacuation and contingency plans. How well do you understand that as being put in place or accessible to people who are in these fire danger zones, or what's being done to make sure people understand how to get out or when they are at risk even?
Well, it's something that California as a state is putting a lot more effort into and really deserves a lot more work. And one of the big challenges with a place like Paradise is that there were really only a couple of roads that allowed people to get out. And especially as power lines and trees came down, the roads were blocked off, and it was really hard to get information about which roads were open, where traffic was moving. There were things like people didn't know whether they should go pick their kids up at school, and so some people drove into the fire thinking they needed to get to the school, even though the school had already evacuated. Oh, and wow. This one of the things that will definitely be seeing the state put additional effort into is sustaining emergency communications. You know, everybody acts like, I have my cell phone, no problem. Mm-hmm. But one of the first things that happens when the grid goes down is that you lose the cell communications.
Sure. And I remember when they were evacuating in Santa Rosa, there was some hesitation as to how or when they should use these emergency evacuation protocols too. And so I don't know if you're privy on that, but I'm assuming or hoping that there has been some improvement in protocols around how to notify people or how to even go about doing that.
Yeah, one of the things that's important to remember with these recent horrific fires in California is that we really didn't have any experience that a fire could be that bad. And one of the things that emergency management personnel always need to pay attention to is the danger from being accused of crying wolf. If a disaster doesn't turn out to be that bad, you know, the next time you have a really bad one, then you can't get anybody to pay attention.
Right.
And so the emergency responders always want to be cautious, and they always want to make sure that there's a real and credible danger when they're asking people to throw everything in their car and get out rapidly. And I think in both those cases, the emergency responders really did an excellent job given how challenging it was. And, you know, in Paradise, super frustrating. Almost 100 lives were lost, but it could have been much worse.
Yeah, and it's a great point you're bringing up around using these measures sparingly, because it can almost just become noise in the background of all the other stimulation we have, right? We get all these Amber Alerts and text messages and things popping up on our phone constantly. And I think you're bringing up a really interesting side of that, because it's really easy to be critical of the first responders and of the people who are supposed to be pulling that trigger or making that notice happen. And it's not that cut and dry, right? There is a certain level of needing to be really sure, otherwise you do devalue these processes.
Yeah, we have lots of experience with hurricane projections where, you know, the landfall is expected to occur in a certain community and it veers to the east or the west at the last minute, and people evacuate, and then they're frustrated that they were sitting in the traffic jams. And the hurricane forecasts have gotten much better, and a lot of the evacuation accuracy is way up. With these recent wildfires in California, a lot of the problem has been that the warning is just super short, and that within a matter of only a couple of hours, it's gone from a remote small fire to this raging inferno that was headed for a town in an unstoppable way. And a lot of the real challenge that we've seen in California is that there really isn't time to develop the careful evacuation measures, and even the decision about whether to call for evacuation. A lot of split-second decisions are required.
Yeah, this sounds like it's bringing us into the issue of thinking about whether we are reacting to problems versus proactively looking at them ahead of time. So I guess this is like the suppression versus prevention line of questioning. If we're thinking about preparing ahead of time, knowing these fire seasons are coming and they're getting worse, versus thinking, reactively to something happening the day of or the moment of, what is the difference in approach to that, and what can people do to even just be more knowledgeable?
Well, there is a lot that can be done to decrease the risks of wildfires. Some of those happen at the very local scale, these defensible spaces and making your home more fire resistant. And some occur much more broadly across the forest, and they range from reducing the amount of fuels that allow fires to climb up into the canopy to become these devastating crown fires. And you can do that with prescribed burns, which is a very effective way to remove they're called ladder fuels. Or you can do it with mechanical processes, with people with chainsaws who cut the little trees and grind them up. There are also lots of things you can do to make the evacuation responses more effective and more successful, and to make sure that there's access for emergency services that help you deal with fire as it occurs. One exciting line of research that's being pursued by people at Stanford is the technology is getting better and better for developing fire suppressants that can be used to prevent ignitions in the most high-risk areas, things like parking lots and picnic grounds. And I'm excited that in the future we may be able to decrease the fire risk, at least in part, by decreasing the number of ignitions.
Is this essentially trying to coat the ground with something that won't burn? Like, I'm guessing a biodegradable something or other? Or?
And it's the same orange stuff that you see being dropped from the airplanes.
Okay.
But it's embedded in material that allows it to stay in place for a long time and then go away the first time it rains.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this would be essentially stopping the spread through proactively identifying the areas that are most at risk.
And if you look around California, we have lots of areas where the increase in wildfires is caused by an increase in ignitions. That's especially true in the shrublands, the chaparral in Southern California. When you go to the forested areas in Northern California, like Paradise, our big problem there is that we actually used to have way more fires, and the fires, when they occur very frequently, every 5 to 10 years, would just stay down on the ground and burn up the grass and the twigs, but not go into the canopies and cause these devastating problems. The ground fires are much easier to control, to stop, to steer, and a lot of our problem in the forested areas of the state is that we've made decades of investment in fire suppression, which has allowed these ladder fuels to accumulate, and it makes it much harder to keep fires in the manageable ground fire stage.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this is sounding again like there's a real man-made element to this, of us stopping the natural flow of fires happening, essentially, I'm guessing, just to protect houses and homes from the inconvenience of controlled burns. And then we end up actually making much bigger problems as a result.
That's right. And when we look at the overall increase in fire risk in California, there's really three factors. One is the climate change. The second one is the increased number of people in the wildland-urban interface, the WUI. And the third is this consequence of decades of fire suppression, which has made the fires much more likely to be the big devastating crown fires. And one of the things that we really need to get a handle on, and the state's going to be investing hundreds of millions of dollars in, is fuel reduction, so there's not so much risk of these devastating crown fires.
Okay, yeah, so fuel reduction is that. Now, if you were, say, living in one of these areas, who would you be wanting to ring their doorbell or contacting as a representative to help make sure these kinds of things are being done at the government and state level?
Well, California has a very good wildfire environment. CAL FIRE is a very professionally run agency. The fuel reduction part of it is complicated and expensive. If you hire people to go out there with chainsaws, that really expensive on a per area treated basis, and it's hard to know exactly, where the fire risks are the greatest. Prescribed burns are very effective, but they're also very difficult to utilize when you have all these accumulated ladder fuels. And even when you don't, there's a risk from smoke exposure and a number of other problems. So I think the state is making progress on quite ambitious prescribed burn goals, and that is a really important part of the puzzle. But another important part is going to be doing mechanical fuel reduction, harvesting, removing, trumping down the fuels where we can't use fire at this point.
Okay. So it sounds like CAL FIRE and those agencies are the ones that are really sort of stuck being responsible for that, and individuals aren't necessarily really able to be much help in the clearing or on advocacy side of it.
Privately owned land, certainly individuals can get permission to do fuel control. There are even some programs that will pay individuals to do fuel reduction. Individuals can get permission to do prescribed burns or work with CAL FIRE. The big problem we have is that culture that encourages prescribed burns hasn't really developed like it should in California. If you look in the southeast U.S., Florida especially, very strong culture of prescribed burns. People recognize that it's a wonderful way to keep ecosystems vibrant and active and really decreases the fire risk. And we just don't have that culture established in California. And we need more people who are expert in prescribed burns, more people who understand how to use them and how to use them effectively in a low-risk way.
Wow, I love that you're bringing up this idea around culture, because it is a human problem and a human caused problem. And essentially at some level, the solution is going to have to be as well. And so what it sounds like you're highlighting in my mind is that people coming together and really making this a priority and not waiting until something happens to them is an important piece of making this part of our actual culture and our society's priority in this particular state, at very least.
Yeah, for sure. The culture has many different dimensions. Some of the dimensions are regulatory. An example is that if you wanted to do a prescribed burn on your property, you might not be allowed to do it because the smoke release from the prescribed burn would be too great, even though if there was a wildfire on the same property that released much, much more smoke, that would be considered an act of God and nobody would worry about it. So there are some things we need to rethink in order to get ahead of the problem. Some of them are cultural in the traditional sense. Some involve more regulatory decisions that we make as a society.
Oh, right. Yeah, and that's a good point to put out there too, is just the culture within communities is also connected to the culture of the regulatory bodies and the way we perceive these problems, even as a government or state agency too.
Yeah, the culture has important manifestations that can come through government policies, they can come through financial incentives, and through the way people feel about the issues and about their neighbors.
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna shift gears a little bit here. We've talked a bit about being in a fire zone, and I'd like maybe if we can talk a bit about the parallel, just because there's been a lot of flooding and hurricane damage and things like that recently that people I think are pretty at least aware of those damages and how that works a little better with insurance and zoning and repairs and things like that. And I'm wondering if we can just talk about the parallels and the differences between fire prevention and flooding prevention and fire insurance versus flooding insurance, and just kind of unpack that as a concept. Sure.
Yeah. And one of the things that's important to recognize is a point that the last 2 years of wildfires in California have really brought home, is that almost everyone in the state is influenced by these wildfires. We had terrible air quality at Stanford when during the campfire at Paradise, the football game was canceled. With the long-term health implications of that are still being explored. And so it's not that the fire impacted just the people who lived in Paradise or just the people who lived in Santa Rosa or Montecito in Southern California. These fires really impact pretty much everybody in the state. And as we think about fire management in the future and about preventing deaths and injuries from fires, we really need to think about this smoke exposure.
Oh, I agree. I was dying a few days into that. I bought an air purifier for my house, and I was just hiding. It was bad.
The air quality in the Bay Area was worse than it was in Beijing or Delhi during that period.
Oh, wow. That really says something, right? I mean, it puts it in context that it is really all of our problem, even if we're not living in an area that is directly a fire zone per se.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then when we think about steps that individuals can take, of course, there are strong parallels between things you can do to make your house hurricane resistant, things like straps to tie down the roof beams, and ways you can take steps to make your home fire resistant. Most people are required to buy fire insurance as a consequence of their not being able to get a mortgage without one. And so most people have fire insurance, and flood insurance is required only if you live in an area that has a flood risk of at least 1% per year. But there are similar things that happen with disaster declarations and with the availability of different kinds of federal support during and following a disaster declaration. I think the thing that's probably most different is that, fires tend to have this, they're totally unexpected until they occur, and then they're totally devastating once they do. And I think in general, people have a little clearer sense that they're in a zone where hurricanes are a possibility and where storm surge is a possibility, and the just sense of total catastrophe in a wildfire, I think, makes it a different category of experience, even though the number of people who lose their homes might be greater in a major hurricane.
Interesting. Yeah. So it seems like you're bringing up the psychological side of really the perception of fire damage versus flooding damage, and how that may just change the way we think about it or prepare for it or even conceptualize what that danger might be.
Yeah. It's just they're both important disasters that we need to be prepared for, and we need to be increasing our investments in dealing with as there are more people in risk zones and as climate change is exaggerating the risk. But there are important differences just in the way they feel and in the implications of being in the line of the disaster.
Right. Now, I'm thinking about, I guess, after Katrina, there was a lot of talk around people shouldn't have been living in some of those areas, that there were actually whole areas that maybe were known to be such bad flooding areas that it probably shouldn't have had people still living there. And I'm thinking about that in terms of fire zones, and if are there actually zones where people are living that are just not safe, that they shouldn't be at all?
That's a conversation that we're just starting to have. And if you look around the country, the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, has purchased almost 50,000 homes that were considered to be in areas where there was just too much flood risk to deal with. So far, the thinking about fire hasn't really reached that level of sort of maturity, but my sense is that if we can figure out how to effectively have communities moving to someplace rather than moving away from someplace, that we may decide there are some areas where the fire risk is simply too great to be managed and where it's not responsible or ethical to let people live in these areas where the fire risk is so great.
Yeah, I'm kind of drawing a parallel here, thinking about, we build cities in places that don't have enough water to support a city, right? And so they pipe in water from other towns, and that becomes essentially it's an unsustainable environment, right? When you can't support simple things like water or safety for the population there, that's not a place where people should be settling in any kind of practical way. And so it sounds like what you're bringing up is that this is essentially something that is also probably happening with fires, but isn't quite yet in the public eye in a way that is willing to say that straightforwardly and say that there actually is not a human habitat here that we should be living in? Or
it's a tough issue. I think the immediate response after a disaster is to try and be tough and to rebuild and to figure that the sign of kind of personal strength is to go back exactly where you were. But we do know that there are lots and lots of homes and communities in areas that are really at risk. I think in some cases, if we were to make a community more fire resistant, it wouldn't necessarily mean plucking up the community from one place and moving it 20 miles away. It might just mean encouraging some people to move from the periphery to the center, thinking hard about the defensible spaces and really rethinking community in the way that works for everybody. And there may be other places where, especially with the smallest communities that are in the highest risk, where if the people decide that they want to relocate, we should have mechanisms that help them do that.
Okay, so we're back to culture, right? If we have a small town, they can band together and really make their town more defensible through having a culture that supports that. And then you brought up this other idea about instead of trying to run away from a place that maybe is high risk, we want to give a destination where people could be, or ways to approach that actually give a way out that is feasible and usable for the people that might be in that highest risk area. So they're not just disappearing, but we're actually facilitating
Yeah. The idea of strategic relocation, it's sometimes called managed retreat, is something that's discussed a lot in coastal areas. And it's been a huge challenge around the world. California, well, in the U.S., in Alaska, there are several native villages that have requested permission to relocate. There's been a lot about Île Saint-Charles in Louisiana that's asked to relocate. Really, really hard to make it happen. And I think that part of the reason it's hard to make it happen is it is expensive and complicated. But part of it is that we've tended in the past to think about, well, we should allow people to leave this area rather than what's going to be required in order for them to have a community that works for them. And if you look at neighborhoods that relocated following Superstorm Sandy in New York in 2012, the ones that moved most effectively and where the sense of accomplishment is greatest is where the community kind of stayed together and were able to focus on community values. Where people just scattered, it really hasn't been as successful.
I mean, this is fascinating to me, because how do you get a community to move anywhere and stay cohesive at all? I mean, that feels like something that would be really hard to pull off in any context.
It is a big challenge, and I think that's the kind of new challenge that we need to confront if we're going to deal effectively with the risks of a changing climate.
Right, and this isn't just about fires either. I mean, we could have volcanoes, and there can be a lot of other natural disasters that are going to possibly be becoming more and more prevalent as climate change is becoming a bigger problem for humanity. But
at the same time, we also have lots of communities that don't work for human design reasons. They have bad transportation infrastructure, or they have bad water and sanitation infrastructure, or the relationship between where people live and where they work isn't very good. And in some ways, rethinking the nature of communities and the nature of the relationships that the people have with their community, it provides some opportunities for doing things better. And that's not to advocate for, wide scale moving of people around, but it doesn't have to be a retreat. It can really be a moving to something. If we think about, well, what are the things that are missing from a community, and how could people band together in order to provide those?
I'm really hearing a lot of your many, many years of experience in this field, because you're not just saying, oh, it's this one little area, it's this one little thing. You keep bringing it back to the cohesive nature of people making something that is sustainable, and how it comes in lots of different forms and is connected to pretty much everything.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that success as a community has elements that are economic, that are sociological, that are psychological, related to the way people feel about not only the nature that they live in, but their neighbors.
Right. And that context is truly part of how we make those decisions. So it's very important that we do make that part of our discussion.
And remember that a lot of these areas at the highest wildfire risk are spectacularly beautiful. They have wonderful recreational amenities that it's not that these are dumps that we're trying to, that we want to abandon. They're nice places to live until there's a fire.
So that's actually, it brings me to the next question I wanted to ask you. How has the landscape been changing in the last few years? What are the effects of this? You mentioned air quality. What else are the kind of trickle down things that become part of this big fire season happening consistently?
Well, my sense is that the impact that most Californians feel most directly is this air quality impact. And, it's hard to quantify, but we're seeing signs of it in hospitalizations, in asthma attacks, and a wide range of impacts. Last year, something like 1.5% of the area of California burned in wildfire. The last 5 years is the only 5-year period in our history where we've lost more than 1 million acres a year on average. So the amount of state area that's been consumed in wildfire is really getting to be a significant fraction. And that's the amount lost in mostly these big, devastating crown fires that take many decades to recover from. And, you can't visit Yosemite now without going through an area that's recently been devastated in a wildfire. So I think that the air quality impacts are important. Almost everyone has friends or family who were directly impacted by the recent fires in Santa Rosa or Montecito or Paradise. And we also at the point where we're spending vast amounts of resources trying to deal with these, and the fact that our main utility, PG&E, is now in bankruptcy has to do with this, the way the fire risk interacts with their responsibilities.
Wow. So this is affecting our natural views of the places we like to visit, like Yosemite and different national parks. It's affecting our health. I'm guessing young people and elderly people are the most affected by those air quality differences, right? It's affecting our utilities and companies' livelihoods and ability to even supply basic things like water and things like that in these areas that are affected, I'm guessing.
And one of the most frustrating things is that we really need the utilities to take the lead in helping us deal with climate change. A lot of the solution to climate change is going to be a transition from fossil-based electricity generation to renewable energy, and that requires investment from the utility. But if the utility is bankrupt from the fire caused by climate change,
right,
you don't have the resources you need.
Wow. So again, we're looking at this interaction between government spending, private company ability to essentially shift focus, because most power right now is still created by burning fossil fuels.
Well, in California, we have a relatively efficient electricity system. The major sources of electricity are natural gas, hydropower. We have some nuclear, and then quite a lot of solar and wind and solar. And California has had several recent periods when wind and solar were really dominant components of the energy mix. And so we've made good progress in California. California now has a legal mandate to reach carbon neutral electricity by 2045. Yeah. And I think we can do it, but we need to be able to make the investments that allow us to do it.
Now, by 2045, my understanding is that the estimates for how climate change is going to be coming very drastically affecting us is that 2045 may be really very far into that process being too late. Is that, do you have a sense of where there's a point of no return for us?
I don't think it's that useful to think about dealing with climate change in terms of a point of no return so much as the longer we wait and the slower we respond, the more residual damages we end up with, and the more it's going to cost us to finally solve the problem. And so from the perspective of someone who thinks about putting together the solutions, the frustrating thing is that we could be making more progress and we could be spending a lot less on that progress if we were more ambitious. If you look at the kind of international community, the agreements that form the core of the Paris Agreement of 2015 represent heading in a good direction. But the idea of the Paris Agreement was always that ambition would have to be increased as people built confidence in their ability to decarbonize and in the commitment of other countries to do it. The richest countries really have the opportunity to decarbonize most rapidly. They also have the opportunity to make money on the technologies that allow us to decarbonize. And I don't think it's very realistic to think that the whole world could decarbonize by 2045. But in California, we can, and we really should, and we should do it before that.
Yeah, and California sits as a leader in these kinds of changes. We're constantly trying to sort of set a precedent for the rest of the country, or maybe even the world, as far as what change could look like.
California is certainly trying to be a leader. It's hard to be a leader in a country that's going backwards on climate change, but all the way from Governor Schwarzenegger through Governor Newsom have really recognize that this is something that is to California's benefit to be a leader in.
Right, and all around the world, we need to be having leaders that are pushing in this direction. So do you have any thoughts about us? We're out of the Paris Agreement now, right? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
Well, the U.S. has announced its intention to leave the Paris Agreement. It's a 3-year process. And at least for me, and then I worked a lot on the science foundations that led to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement really did two things. It established a sense of what's fair in the international markets, and it said to countries, here's the trajectory we're headed on, and it should give you the predictability to make long-term planning decisions about your electricity generation, your transportation, the way you deal with land use. And the frustrating and really devastating impact of the U.S. intention to withdraw is that this sense of fairness has been totally shattered, and the sense of predictability has. And so the two key elements that were pointing the world in direction of solving the climate challenge have really been badly eroded by the U.S. decision to withdraw. Lots of other countries are still in, and there's an amazing movement called the We Are Still In movement that many states and many companies, many universities are a part of. And it's the commitment to still stick to the goals of the Paris Agreement, but it's really hard to do it when this sense of fairness and predictability has been so badly eroded.
Yeah, and there is a certain level of accountability that needs to be held across different country borders, because if one country is not trying at all and then the next door neighbor is, it's almost like pointless for one person to be essentially costing themselves economic advantage just to try to support environmental changes if everyone around them isn't. So there is a certain reciprocity that needs to be in place.
Well, yes, although, we used to think in terms of needing to spend a lot of money to address climate change. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is that many of the steps don't cost money. They, in fact, make money. And an example now is that electricity from photovoltaics is almost always cheaper than electricity from natural gas at this point. And so it's not a given, and it's not obvious that if the U.S. doesn't take steps to decarbonize electricity, then Canada or Mexico shouldn't as well. And in fact, I think they're often big opportunities. Many of the biggest opportunities is who's going to be the technology leader, who's going to be able to sell the systems and the system integration into future markets. So I do think that there are still really profound advantages, but the way the international community views the U.S. is that historically it's the largest emitter, and it's the country that's technologically and financially most competent to put accelerated solutions in place. And if the U.S. doesn't step up to the challenge, it's just really, really hard to do the political lift of getting any other country to do it.
Right, but I love that you're bringing up the economic advantages of getting involved early, because there really are, if people are getting ahead of the curve and creating these new technologies and being the trendsetters, there's a lot of lucrative opportunity there, and there's need for it that's going to become more and more prevalent as the years pass.
Yeah, many of the biggest economic opportunities of the 21st century are clearly going to be related to energy delivery and adaptation to the climate changes we can't avoid. And lots of countries are investing a lot in being the technology and integration leaders, information leaders in these areas. And the U.S. is too, but not at the level it should be. And I think that it's really tragic to see some of the manufacturing capabilities and some of the knowledge capabilities being now most strongly developed in China or most strongly developed in Europe rather than in the U.S.
Right. To stay a world leader, we need to be up ahead of the curve on all these world changes that are happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we need to be figuring out how to do a lot of this stuff. And especially when you think about an integrated system of electricity and transportation and land use, you really need experience to figure out what works and what doesn't, and then deploy those in a way that is attractive for the rest of the world.
Right. Now, we're getting really close to being out of time here, and I'm just wondering if there was 3 things that you could just wave a magic wand at right now to make our situation better concerning climate change or fire prevention or any of these things. What would be your top 3? Just wave the wand, make them better so that we could start moving in the direction of fixing and helping our situation.
Well, let me start with fires. I think with fires, if we can manage this accumulation of fuels that are a result of the fire suppression in past decades, it would make fires much easier to deal with. And then the second thing I really love to see happen with fires is sufficient funding and financial resources so that communities can make smart steps about defensible spaces and fire hardening homes. But I want to save the third one and the most important one for the broader climate change solutions.
Okay.
And I think that there, the most important magic wand I could wave would be to have the U.S. population and the U.S. government represent what a great opportunity and a great responsibility it is to be ambitious in tackling climate change so that we can really get to the point of zero greenhouse gas emissions by and before the middle of this century.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first, or maybe for the 10th time, because this is stuff that should be out there already. And if it's not, we're really glad to have had Chris Field in the studio today to talk about climate change and wildfire season. Chris, thank you so much for making the time to come in. This has been really great for me, and I hope for the listeners as well.
I enjoyed it, Ben. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I am your host here once again in the studio, and we have been talking today with Chris Field, learning about fire safety, wildfire problems and solutions. And this is Ben Woodford here Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute with Modern Education.